Okay, hello and welcome to Partnership Connections. This is a child welfare training and education podcast for those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare in Rhode Island. My name is Stan Brazier, and I am the project director for the learning partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF, and Rhode Island College. Our desire is to bring information from experts on a variety of topics, all at no cost, to hardworking professionals and others. Today, I'm very excited to speak with our guests about generational diversity and how it might be impacting your work and relationships in the child welfare workforce. It's no secret that different generations come with their own set of experiences and ways of looking at the world. But how do we better understand these differences for better relationships, better communication, and an overall better work environment? Our guests are here to give us some practical tools and insights into navigating this complex web. Please note, before we begin, a disclaimer that the views expressed by the host and guests of this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the college, DCYF, or the organization or institutions that they might represent. So, without further ado, our guests are Tricia Driscoll and Stephanie Manzi. Tricia is the executive director of the Center for Mediation and Collaboration of Rhode Island. She has more than 25 years of nonprofit experience. She's worked to help individuals and groups develop positive communication and leadership skills. She has a BA in sociology-based human relations from Connecticut College and an MAT from Rhode Island College. She's a trained mediator, also certified in workplace mediation. She facilitates trainings in basic mediation, peer mediation, generational diversity, leadership development, conflict resolution, navigating change, and communication. Our other guest is Stephanie Manzi. She's a professor of criminal justice at Roger Williams University, teaching courses in policing and criminology. She earned a PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the University of Maryland at College Park. Stephanie was trained in facilitative mediation by CMCRI in 2016, and she also facilitates trainings in basic mediation, implicit bias, general racial diversity, conflict resolution, navigating change, and communication. So welcome to you both. It's great to see you. Thank you for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, Stan, thank you so much for having us. We're pretty excited. Stephanie and I are grateful for the opportunity to talk about leading across the generations and maybe give some tips and techniques for making it through this chaotic world that we're all in.
Yeah, no, sounds great. So can you start by telling us like what the current landscape of which quote unquote generations are in the current workforce? I'm a millennial, so that means I was born after 1981, 82, something like that. What are the other generations that are out there right now?
So right now we have 5 different generations in the workforce, which is historic because we don't usually have that many at the same time. The 5 that we're looking at is the silent generation, right? The traditionalists, the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and then Gen Z. Traditionalists make up about 2% of the workforce. Baby boomers are 19%. Gen X is about 36%, millennials 40%, and then Gen Z is 6%. And so what we have to keep an eye out too is they're anticipating Gen Z is going to just pop into the workforce and kind of overtake us in the next year or two. So it's a different time. You had mentioned that, we all know different generations look at things differently. They're impacted by what they've lived through, but we all have the same needs and we all go through the same life stages. It's just the things that we've experienced as a group change how we look at things, especially how we see the workforce, how we see other people. And we tend to stereotype, right? Millennials get a bad rap. The stereotype there is that they're entitled. Gen Z is the me generation, right? Gen X, me and Tricia over here, are the sandwich generation. There's not that many of us, so we tend to get overlooked. But we know stereotypes aren't absolute truths, right? They kind of keep us stuck, and that's part of the problem is we go, oh, they're a baby boomer, so this must be what they're thinking, and it's not necessarily true.
I think one of the things that we talk a lot about too, Stan, is the perception, as Stephanie said, the stereotypes. There's a great quote by George Orwell that says, every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. And this is really just that sort of perspective that wherever you are is kind of better than everyone else. And when you start with that kind of a perspective, it makes it really hard to listen to older and younger generations. It makes it hard to imagine that they could have valuable knowledge or insight that could be helpful, especially in the workplace. So, part of navigating through these 5 generations that are in the workplace is trying to really come at it with a very open mind and a very sort of listening ear to really think about the fact that there could be value that other people are bringing, and to not really be so focused on yourself and what is good for you and what works for you, and really be open to what's good and what works for the other generations.
Right. And I want to dive into more of that. But one thing that you mentioned, Stephanie, was the transitioning and the I think it was I forget exactly which generation you mentioned, but you said they're about to overtake. So can you tell maybe in sort of a very high level overview what's happening in terms of like transitions? We've got baby boomers that are getting older. We've got people that, the younger generations are also getting older and moving into the workforce. Is there anything you could tell us a little bit about like some of the like big transitions and shifts that we're seeing people move in and out of the workforce or transition into retirement age and that sort of thing? And what does that kind of look like, and what does that mean for any of us out in the workforce right now?
Sure. I think some of the issue is that, so we've got the silent generation, which is basically they're in their 80s and 90s. So they're almost out of here, right? And then you've got the baby boomers, who are those, maybe they're delaying retirement or they're in a second career. But they had a very different outlook on life. Everything, the workplace to them, they worked to live, right? Work was it for them. They believed in structure. You put in your time. You have to be seen. So those 2 generations would not prefer a Zoom call like this. They wanted the face-to-face time. But so they're moving out. Now with Gen X, what we have to look for here is that, we're in the 45 to 60-year-old range now, and there's so few of us. You're not going to see too much of us in management, which means you're going to be looking past us to the millennials. And so what I think one of the big differences is going to be is the technology, because we know the millennials, you grew up online, right, Stan? You don't remember a time when there wasn't a computer, wasn't a cell phone. And then you've got Gen Z who
just barely. I can hear the modem dialing up in our basement right now, but I can't. Yeah, just barely a little bit before that.
Yeah. And then with Gen Z, I mean, they were definitely born online. So you're looking at 2 generations that definitely want to be in person, and 2 generations that really, really want flexibility in the workplace. They want to have opportunities and options. And they also look for more, they're looking for work that has more meaning. They want to know that the companies and agencies they work for have great values and give back to the community. So those are, I think, those are going to be some of the shifts. As the younger kids push us out, the workplace could look very different in certain fields. If you have a career and a job that doesn't have to be 9 to 5, why is it 9 to 5? And that's going to be the question that we're going to be facing as we're leaving the workforce, because you may have someone in Gen Z saying, well, why do I have to be here at 9 a.m.? I'm not seeing anybody. Why can't I be here at 11? And do you have a good answer for that? Maybe not.
Yeah. And Stephanie, I think following up on that, some of the things that we talk about, some of the baby boomers and the Gen X really working and that being their identity. As you go sort of to the younger generations, work is a mechanism. It's a means to the end, and the end is living. When you talk about work-life balance, for some of the older generations in the workplace, that means your 2-week vacation every year. That means your weekends. That means nights. For the younger generations, that means whatever they define it as. One of the big differences between the younger generations, those entering generations in the workplace, is their ability to question everything. So everything is negotiable. So if you're in Gen Z, so again, that's, you're between, 13, 14 up to sort of 28, 29, your whole life has been negotiable. right? So you've been through COVID, which means that your education looked different, your job prospects looked different. There are many, many folks in Gen Z and even millennials who have never been in an office before. So they have only had either hybrid or remote type of work. And so work has a different place in their lives. And their ability to navigate through that is very different. I think, when you talk to some of the, even go back to the silent generation and the baby boomers, the idea of questioning a work schedule or a salary, a promotion, benefits, that's just not something that would have happened. You started a company, you get your benefits package, and that's how it is. And maybe every year you get a cost of living increase or something like that. For our younger generations, everything's negotiable. Where I work, what I wear to work, what time I come into work, do I come into work, what I'm doing, when I take my vacation, it's everything is negotiable. And for the generations that are a little bit older and are typically in a manager or a supervisor role, that's very, it's challenging, right? It's challenging. Why are you asking all these questions? This is just the way it is, right? And you can hear yourself saying that.
I was going to ask, is it fair to say that is a little bit frightening for some of the older generations because they've never had that pushback before? They've never had, employees asking that many questions or challenging things or, challenging the status quo.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think for, again, the structure that older generations are used to. So here's the hierarchy. Here's, you put in 5 years here and you move up to the next rung and you get a new title and you get a promotion and, everything was kind of laid out for you. You understood the map, right? Everything was very clear. That map doesn't exist anymore. And so for people who are used to that structure and that map, it doesn't mean that they can't navigate through the new world. It just means that it's very different. Whereas our Gen Z and our millennials are like, what map? There isn't a map. I'm forging my own path. It's more than just thinking about working for one company or organization your whole life and getting a gold watch at retirement and retiring at 65, right? Those quote unquote norms that used to be present in the American workplace, they're not there anymore. And I think for folks who have had that for most of their working careers, not having that is a very scary proposition.
Right. You mentioned, technology and how it's changed the workplace a lot too, right? What are some of the other major there's societal, we have all this whole new generation, which for me is kind of crazy to think about that they were not born, when 9/11 happened, right? Like these major, historical and cultural events that really shifted and changed our world. So what are some of the other examples of things that has influenced different generations and how they see work and interact with others and other employees, coworkers, and clients that they might be serving in the workplace?
I think one area, and Trish, feel free to jump in here, is personal well-being, right? The younger generations are more open to talking about mental health and needing me time and sick days. I wouldn't talk about that at work. You had your personal days, your sick time, you used it. Nobody knew why. You just weren't there. Now we have younger generations that are just more open about it. And it doesn't mean one of those is right or wrong. It's just different. These kids were raised to share. I don't know, maybe some of it's oversharing, but they have no problem saying, I'm taking a me day tomorrow. I never would have thought of doing that. I mean, maybe now I am because I see it happening, but a lot of it is just the younger generations, I think, are much better at taking care of themselves than we were because we accumulate. How many vacation days do you have accumulated? Probably more than 20. It's because you don't go unless you absolutely have to go. You don't call out sick unless a limb's hanging off, right? And that's just not how it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Stephanie's right. I think the other, we have older generations have something to learn from the younger generations about that sort of work-life balance. Right. And I think, when you think about older generations of sort of, the phrase is working yourself to the bone and having, just that 1-2 weeks off in the summertime or, whatever that looked like. The younger generations, again, because you can look at it this way, older generations had a lot of structure because the world was pretty structured. There were good guys and bad guys. You had your home, you had your spaces where you felt comfortable. The world was a pretty ordered and structured place. For these, individuals that are born, in the last, 20, 30, even 40 years, That is not the case. Their world has always been chaotic. Whether it's 9/11, whether it's COVID, whether it's the falling of the Berlin Wall, whether it's, the declining, all of these world events have created instability, and that's really been the constant for them. So when you think about younger generations, you understand why they are taking maybe more control over their own work life because everything else feels so out of control. So whereas older generations look to work to provide that structure and that stability, younger generations are saying, no, thank you. I will provide that for myself. I will take responsibility for doing that. And that's why you see them, again, negotiating. And when they negotiate, we're not talking about just salaries. One of the things that's also a hallmark of younger generations is that they value other things. They value time off. They value professional development. They value volunteer opportunities. They volunteer flexible schedules. So, and flexible doesn't just mean, hybrid or remote. It means, you know what? I'm really great from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. So I'm going to work then instead of working in the middle of the day when I could be out, taking my dog for a walk or whatever it is. So they have been able to think about things in a different way. The biggest clash, Stan, is that most of the supervisors and managers are of sort of a baby boomer Gen X, and most of the workers are, millennials and Gen Z. So you see, that's just a natural pushback, right? If I'm trying to have structure in the workplace and someone else is trying to avoid structure in the workplace, that's where a lot of our challenges come from. And what ends up happening in many workplaces is we all talk about sort of norms or professionally, and professionalism is a great term. The problem is there's no universal definition. So one of the things that comes up all the time in workplaces is professional dress. What are you wearing to work? If you have to go into work, or even if you don't have to go into work, what are you wearing? And that definition is a very slippery slope. You may have folks in the workplace right now who are used to maybe wearing a suit or maybe wearing a dress or a skirt, things like that. And then you have younger generations who are definitely not wearing that, maybe wearing much more casual, pajama pants or sweatpants or whatever. And
Slippers.
that causes slippers, right? That causes a clash because both generations are looking at the other one saying, why are you doing that? And again, as Stephanie said, there's no right or no wrong, but the path through all of this is conversation, transparency, communication. Right. Otherwise, you end up, we tell our classic example of a clash of generations in the workplace. There's an office and folks have to be to work at 8 o'clock. So the baby boomer is at work at 7:45. They're ready to go because 8 o'clock is the time. So you're there early because that's how you are and you're ready to go. The Gen Z rolls in at 9:20 with their AirPods in, carrying a cup of Mary Lou's coffee, and doesn't understand, why the baby boomer has been enraged for the last 40 minutes because they're late. And so that's a classic clash in any workplace, is just a lack of common ground about what work is, what it means, and what the expectations are.
Yeah, I'm glad we started talking about self-care, because I think it's fair to say that the child welfare arena, it's a high stress, high pressure work environment oftentimes, right? And I think one of the other things you mentioned too was that the younger generations are looking for a lot more purpose driven work. So how do we sort of balance that continued relationship between older generations and younger generations, and how they're, especially when you're seeing a lot more infusion of a younger workforce into this work environment and this work culture that's, again, like I said, I think it's fair to say it. I think there's continues to be a push towards that when you talk about social work and social service, self-care. But I think there's still a lot of burnout, and people can be prone to burnout. So I guess it's sort of, what's the sort of the advice to the younger generation, maybe some of the people that are coming into the child welfare workforce, around interacting and engaging with that older workforce that has a very different view of self-care, they've been seasoned in this work, and they've seen it all. And then here comes somebody that's very green, and they're really passionate and empathetic and want to do good and help others. And they also want to take care of themselves. So what's maybe some advice or some tips or strategies that you could give maybe to some of the younger generation that's entering into this workforce that's had its challenges with preventing burnout?
My first suggestion, the first thing that comes to mind is you've got to get them all into the same room talking about this because they're all stereotyping each other,
Right.
right? My mom is this generation, my dad's this generation, and this is how they did it. So they must all be that way. And then we see people who want to, younger people who want to come in later and we're going, that's not right. You have to get us all in the room. You have to get us all together so we can learn from each other and we can have an understanding of your thought process on time and my thought process on time. And maybe the younger generations can get the older generations to relax a little bit and see that your life isn't just work. And maybe some of us old timers can teach the youngins something here and there, right? But it starts with education. They've got to understand where each other's coming from and why. And again, one isn't right and one isn't wrong, but get them in the same room, get them talking, let them learn something from one another.
I think there's two really important things that Stephanie shared. So one of them is that the typical way that generations relate to each other in the workplace is through their knowledge of family connections, right? So most 25-year-olds don't hang out with 65-year-olds unless they're related to you, and vice versa. And so what happens in the workplace is, if I'm a 25-year-old, Gen Z, I'm treating my supervisor the same way I treat my mother, my aunt, etc. And that's not a workplace relationship. That's a personal relationship, and vice versa. If I'm the 65-year-old supervisor, I'm treating, little Stephanie as like my kid, and that's how I'm engaging with her. And so keeping in mind that workplace relationships are just that. They are workplace relationships, and they are not the same as family relationships. So I think that's really important. And the other piece is that and this is especially for managers and supervisors, you have to be clear about what things are negotiable, right? You have to be really clear that if folks being in the office or being at work at a certain time or a certain report or something like that is non-negotiable, then you have to be clear about that. And you have to also be clear about the things that are negotiable. Because what happens is if you think that either everything is or everything isn't, that's where the clashes and the conflicts happen. So as Stephanie said, the best thing to do is straight away from the beginning, jump right in and say, look, we can be flexible on the hours that you're working, or we can be flexible on the days that you're working, or we can be flexible on what you wear. Here's the things that we can't be flexible on. So once everyone knows, that arrangement, then they can really actively and really, effectively participate in conversations around what that means to them. So for younger generations, if you are in a position where your manager or supervisor is not being transparent or clearly communicating, then it really does fall to you to initiate those conversations and recognize that it's a compromise. Right? It's always going to be a compromise. There's going to be a path. Maybe you're going to get to wear your pajama pants to work, but maybe you're going to have to work until 7:00 p.m. or whatever it is. So I think, one of the most important things for everyone to realize is that this is a back and forth. It's a little bit of a give and take, but you can only have give and take if you know what's at stake.
Right. I think there's a few things in there that I also want to kind of transfer over to the younger generation, the younger social worker coming in to work with now a family, not having this peer-to-peer, colleague-to-colleague relationship, but they've got to come in being much younger to work with maybe a family, parents, caregivers, foster parents, whatever the case might be, that could be maybe a lot older than them and have a lot different experiences. And I think you touched on sort of the transparency and open, honest communication, and also this power dynamic, which now gets shifted from their supervisor over them to now they have this sort of power and authority over this family that's involved in the child welfare system. So what's kind of maybe some of your advice around that now that the dynamic has shifted a little bit? Is it just that kind of continuing to be open? How much transparency should they and open communication? As an example, like for a long time, I was, and now I am a new parent, so I don't have to worry about it as much. But in the past, been working with parents and doing, quote unquote parent education, but not being a parent myself was internally challenging for me, right? So I chose not to disclose that up front unless it was asked of me. What's maybe some of your, thoughts or advice around some of that when things kind of get the power dynamic gets shifted?
Yeah, I think that's really hard, Stan, and you're absolutely right. Look, most of us hear advice better if we think that someone has a similar experience, right? So, for example, if you are a parent, you tend to listen to other parents. I know, and if you are a parent and there's a challenging situation, sometimes the last thing you want to hear is from someone who isn't a parent, or maybe it is, but just much younger, is giving you advice on how to be a parent. Right. That just, it doesn't land well. And so I think for the younger social workers out there, I think the most important thing, first and foremost, is to establish really sort of, I'm not going to say a level playing field because we know there's a power dynamic there, but really to establish sort of that communication partnership that we both at the end of the day, everyone wants what's best for the child. Right? The social worker wants that and the family wants that. And I know that seems obvious, but sometimes you really have to say that because I know certainly, sometimes social workers get a bad rap. Oh, you don't have my child's best interest. I know them best. Why are you doing this? And I think there's some inherent conflict there. And so for the social worker to immediately start to build that trust that the end game is the same, right? We're all going for the same goal. And their role is that support, their role is that partnership. And that role also may include a little bit of that power dynamic that they will have, reports to file. They will have, feedback and follow up. I think the hardest thing or the most challenging thing to do is to come into that relationship and sort of have a chip on your shoulder because you're not a parent. I think that's hard. And I think that is sort of immediately felt by everyone. I tend to personally, Stan, I tend to agree with you. If you're not a parent, I wouldn't necessarily come in and say, hey, even though I'm not a parent, I can help, because I think that's hard to hear. Right. And that's absolutely true. There are many great social workers and child welfare professionals who are not parents who are awesome at their job. It's not a prerequisite, right? But I think, when you open with that, that's tough to sort of overcome. So I think opening with anything that talks about partnership, that talks about collaboration, that talks about support, and acknowledges that a parent or a family member or guardian has a really important role to play in the welfare of that child. And everyone has a role to play. And I think identifying that is really important, and that the social worker or the child welfare professional is not there to take the parent's role or to take the guardian's role. You're there to support. And I think that's really important. These are tough times. You're not meeting people when they're at their best. Right. This is, and I think anytime folks are in a stressful situation that involves children, they're not at their best through maybe no fault of their own, or maybe there are bad, choices that they made that they wish they could take back. But for the professionals to come in, I think, and be in that supportive role is incredibly helpful. It really gives them another grown up to kind of bounce things off of. I mean, I know I can't be the only parent who's surprised that there really wasn't a parent handbook once your child comes into the world. And I think, I think many parents feel that way, but I think it is, I think, especially hard for younger workers, but I also think it's pretty hard for social workers who have years of experience and who may be parents or grandparents themselves. That's also hard, because then the likelihood that you will be offering advice and things like that, again, that also might be taken, in a tough way. So I think, each generation, to me, faces its own unique challenges in managing that power dynamic with families.
Yeah, so I don't know, like we said about just kind of placing the focus on the child and what the end goal will be, and the supportive, continual, ongoing supportive role that you're there to play. You're not there to tell anyone what to do. We just want to be able to support you to be able to reunify or continue to have your child stay in the home with safety considerations around these things. And like you said, it's not a prerequisite. You don't have to be a parent necessarily to have that job, but there are other reasons and other qualifications why you would. So maybe leaning on some of those things, right? To kind of focus on, not that you're intentionally misleading the parent or anything like that by doing that, but saying like, I do know about X, Y, and Z, and I can help you with those things. I might not be, and if it does maybe be, has to be addressed that you aren't a parent, or you do or you don't have a certain type of experience, then, you could say, all right, that I recognize that, right? But I want to focus on what I can help you with and what I am good at, to have that kind of continuous, like, open communication and transparency.
Yeah, and I think there's some ways that you can share that information, Stan. There's language that you can use, using yes and, yes, you're the parent. and I have
Right.
some expertise to share. There are some ways that you can have conversations that just land differently, right? And I think the more that you can use that kind of language that is collaborative, that indicates a partnership, the better off you're going to be. Look, there's no question that there are going to be hard decisions, and there are going to be decisions made that not everyone agrees with. Right. That's
Right.
sort of the nature of that business. But you can do it in a way that is kind and clear and compassionate, that again has that end goal in mind. I think one of the suggestions that we always make to everyone who is in any kind of a conflict situation is to obviously do more listening than you're talking, but also to consistently ask the question why. Like, I wonder why this parent is responding this way. I wonder why the child is responding this way. I wonder why this is happening. I think, making assumptions on how things or why things happen really never works out in the end. So if you can just keep in your mind to stay curious and think about, I wonder why this happened. Look, families don't purposely make choices that lead them to involvement, with the child welfare system. That's not a purposeful choice. It's something that happens, and people take responsibility for that. And then, very often they're able, with the support of the professionals, to actually make a different choice down the road. And so keeping that in mind is I think first and foremost very difficult, but also the easiest path to success.
Right. Yeah. Shifting back to technology, we can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? The technology continues to impact our daily lives more and more. So, any other insights, into how different generations are approaching technology? Everyone has different strengths. So, what are some things to kind of take into consideration when you're trying to understand different generational approaches to an understanding of technology and avoiding maybe some frustrations? I will admit some guilt around, some generational frustration with technology. But what's some of your advice around that?
I think my first suggestion would be you have to give people some time to adjust, right? We can't expect the older generations to be able to pick up an iPad or an iPhone and figure it out, right? So it's really just kind of taking a breath and just, letting everybody learn at their own pace. And if you have people who aren't willing to learn how to use the technology, then you find something else for them that they're really good at to do. I mean, some of the best things that companies could do is put younger generations with older generations on a project together, because they both have different strengths. Part of, I think, the bigger problem in our culture is we're always looking for ways to divide and not pull together. But I love to do research. I love to write. I don't like to put a PowerPoint together. So you want to match me with the Gen Z who can make that PowerPoint look so snazzy and put in clips, because if I do it, it's just going to be a word salad, right? And there's not going to be anything fun in there. So it's understand where people are. We shouldn't expect everybody to be a tech whiz. It'd be nice if everybody tried, but some people are kind of stuck in their ways. So recognize it. If it's that big of an obstacle, you can find ways around it. It's about talking. Again, like what Tricia said, what's the commonality here? We're all in this workplace to do what? How do we get there if one person on the team isn't as good as another person on something? There's got to be something they're good at, and let's leverage the positives. Let's leverage their strengths.
Yeah, and I think following up on that, Stephanie, the other thing is, again, why are you using technology? What is it for? Right. And I think that's, again, this goes back to that overarching philosophy of, for younger generations, technology is used to be more efficient, right? It's about time. It's about creating, making work time less and out of work time more. For older generations, the process of work is not just the end product. The process of work is you and I are sitting in a room together. We're brainstorming. We're connecting. We're talking. It has a more global, or sort of a broader meaning, and a broader, there's a different reason. So in a workplace, there are times when you want to be as efficient as possible. Great. So that's a great time for technology. But you know what? There are some times when the goal of work is actually connection. And especially in the human services field, those connections are important. Sometimes you don't want to be as efficient as possible. Sometimes you want to give things time because you're dealing with other humans and human concerns and feelings and things like that. So understanding why you're using technology is also really important. And the other thing I would say, having, as Stephanie said, she and I are sort of in that middle generation. So we've got tech savvy kids and not tech savvy parents. So I've been on the sort of receiving end of my kids trying to teach me new technology and trying to help my parents learn new technology. And one of the things that never works is when you just say, let me do it for you, right? We've got to struggle through it. And again, for younger generations, that's frustrating. No, I can do it faster. I don't need you to do it faster. I need to learn. But then I turn into that very same person when I'm trying to, show my dad how to do something on his iPad. I turn into, no, let me just do it. And so remembering that, as Stephanie said, everyone needs time, and teaching is better than doing.
Yeah, I think the same could be said for having that relationship with someone, social worker to client, family, parent, whatever it might be, where it's like the empowerment piece is so big in social work and these areas of work, right? Like we don't necessarily, there are certain times where you may need to do some hand holding, but there are some times where we need to maybe like take a step back and like, you need to make that phone call on your own. You need to be able to like set this appointment up. You need to be able to navigate this system or this area of your life. And I can kind of maybe help it guide you a little bit, but I can't do it for you because I'm not going to be here forever. And you need to be able to learn how to do some of this stuff on your own. And then it also kind of sounds to like not going from 0 to 100 when it comes to technology, right? Like maybe taking it a little bit at a time in order to accommodate everyone, right? And we know that everyone learns differently in technology. I think that's another thing that I think speak for myself, and I'm probably some of the younger generations, right? Where it's just like you said, it's let me do it because it'll be faster. Without really understanding, there isn't any pretext for some people when it comes to certain technologies. Like we're raised on computers and then went into smartphones, and things just kind of become like more intuitive where it's not for other people, right? And I think that some of the younger generation, like I said, I think speaking for myself and probably some others, we need to have some more patience, and we need to be able to recognize that if something could be incredibly foreign to someone, and it's really difficult to understand, whereas to us it's just like second nature. So I think there's that aspect.
Yeah, and you're spot on, Stan. And I think part of that, a lot of that really falls in the communication technology, right? So older generations are much more likely to pick up the phone, right? And younger generations are not. They're likely to use, some sort of platform or email or whatever it is. And I think inherent in that is some judgment, right? So older generations don't understand why younger generations aren't using the phone. So if a supervisor asks, someone to reach out to one of their cases, oh, I emailed them 4 times, they haven't gotten back to me. So then the older generation will be like, well, why didn't you just pick up the phone? And vice versa. So so I think inherent in some of that learning and some of that comfort with different communication methods is a little bit of judgment. Why aren't you doing things the way that I do them? Why aren't you using this? Why aren't you using Slack? Why aren't you using one of the other platforms? Why aren't you making a phone call? So I think that again goes back to how we always want to try and be open, transparent, not as judgy as we normally are as humans, and really understand that there are communication methods that are absolutely appropriate for lots of different things. So sometimes a phone call is the right way to go. And sometimes a Slack message is the right way to go. And sometimes email it, and so understanding that there's a place for everything helps people to be more comfortable with the myriad opportunities for communication that we have out there.
It's funny that you mentioned phone call, because I had someone say, can you give me a call? And I said, what's your number? And then it took me a few seconds and I realized, oh, they want me to call them on Microsoft Teams. I didn't really, because I don't really use Teams very often. So I was like, oh, I'm the one that's at the technology deficit here, because they're ahead of me saying that like, give me a call meant call them on Teams, and then we could have a, it's like a FaceTime call, right? So it's just funny that you mentioned that. So final question is, well, what do we say? What do you both say? Kind of the person that says, oh, can we just all get along? In the workplace, like I just want everyone to get along. What's the response to that?
You absolutely can get along if you're willing to learn from one another. You've got to look again for those commonalities. What are we working towards? How do we want our work culture to be? Don't look at things that divide us. keep trying to pull together those things that we share, that we have in common.
Yeah, I think I agree with Stephanie. And I think what we would say to people is you absolutely can all get along, but you have to work at it.
Yeah.
Right. These are
Work.
things that don't happen naturally. I think folks expect because you work at the same place or in the same field that naturally it's just all going to be, kittens and rainbows. And the reality is that just like you have to work at other relationships in your life, you have to work at your work relationships and make it what you want it to be. And again, the more clear communication you can have as sort of both a worker and as a supervisor, the more likely it is that you're going to have a good match. The worst matches in workplaces are ones where there is little to no communication, lots of assumptions, lots of judging. And on the flip side, the best workplaces are one where everyone knows what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it, who they can rely on, what do they need to do if something's going off the rails. Those are the commonalities of really great workplaces that have a culture that people really thrive in. And I think especially again in human services, the work is so hard. Right. You're not counting widgets. You're not, this is really hard people work. And especially, in the world that we live in today. And so it becomes even more important to have that communication, to stay curious about why people are doing things, and to just always kind of take that breath and say, okay, what is my role in this? Because every single person has a role to play. Workplace culture is not just for supervisors to determine. It's not just for employees to determine. It's for everyone to kind of come together. And that's when you all get along, is when everyone is having those conversations on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, I like the fact that there's the caveat there. Like, yes, we can, but however, we need to work at it. We need to communicate. We need to be able to build trust and rapport with each other and that kind of thing. So I like that. We can't just sit back and say, oh yeah, we can do that. And it's everything takes care of itself. We have to kind of work at it too. Right. So
Absolutely.
any final thoughts? Anything else you feel like is important when it comes to this topic that you want to share? Especially again, like with our target audience being child welfare, social work, and in a larger sense, right? And sort of difficult challenges and difficult cases, scenarios, high stress work environment, And I think one of the other big challenges too, and is going back to the self-care piece. We want to have prioritize self-care. It's difficult, I think, sometimes because you can become so invested in supporting that individual or that family, and it is people's lives, and it could be challenging to kind of get over that hurdle when thinking about how to prioritize your own self-care or anything like that. So I think like final thoughts.
Yeah, I think the most successful way to practice self-care is actually to have someone else who's helping to hold you accountable, right? And I think,
Yeah.
in the human service field, it often feels so solo, right? It feels,
Mhm.
because you are responsible really for, this series of cases. And I think we all know how to take care of ourselves. We just don't. And
Yeah.
so what we do
Mhm.
know is that if you don't prioritize that, eventually something breaks, something gives, right? And it's
Right.
usually that's when you have burnout. That's when you have people who really miss important work things because they're at that end. So having someone that you really, and this could be your supervisor, it could be a colleague, it could be a family member or a friend who really, you may say to them, look, every Wednesday, I'm going to make sure at 5 o'clock that I leave work or whatever it is. And making sure that you're
Right.
checking in with each other or making sure
Yeah.
that you are, something simple. Are you drinking enough water? Right? Did you have lunch today? What'd you eat for breakfast? Some of those little things, but having someone else, the thing about us as humans is we're not real good at taking care of ourselves, but we don't want to disappoint other people. So if I say to Stephanie, can you just check in with me, around 10 and make sure that, I had a snack because, I'm going to get hungry, so I may not have a snack, but when Stephanie, reaches out to me and says, hey, how you doing? Oh, right. I want to be able to say to Stephanie, oh, I did. So having someone to help you through that is the most effective way to practice self-care. And I think being consistent about self-care, and again, work-life balance and self-care is just that, it's a balance. Sometimes you can't go to a spa day because you've got work to do. So sometimes that happens, right? And
Yeah.
so again, being clear and open with the people you work with about what are the negotiables and what are the non-negotiables, but having that buddy, having that person to help you is really the most successful way for people to balance out their personal self-care and their effectiveness at work.
I agree with all of that because we all don't like mandatory fun.
Right. Exactly.
So,
Right.
I mean, because I was thinking, well, some workplaces will just give people an extra couple of hours off at the holidays when things are hectic and really busy, instead of saying, okay, everybody has to come to this retreat where not only do you not want to be there, but you're missing work and missing out on other opportunities. But I like the keeping each other accountable to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great insight, great conversation. Thank you both so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
We hope to have you back in the future. Any final thoughts? Final thoughts.
Thank you to all of you. You're doing great work out
Yes.
there, and hopefully everyone's supporting you in the way that they can. So keep it
Right
up.
on. All right.
Exactly.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.